Hi everybody, this is Paul from Profit Bandit. Today we're here for our third Profit Bandit subscribers only webinar, and today we're going to be talking about global selling. Um, Global selling is really important because, as I'm sure a lot of you know who only sell on one Amazon marketplace, it's getting a lot more competitive. It's harder to make a profit than it's ever been in the past, and diversifying your business is really important. And one way to diversify your business is by starting to sell on multiple Amazon marketplaces. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Um, just right off the bat, who here sells on more than one Amazon marketplace? Anybody? I'm not seeing a lot of response about that, so I'm going to assume that most everybody here sells on only a single Amazon marketplace. And that's great, because this is going to be a very basic introduction to global selling. Some of the concepts can be a little complicated and a little hard to explain um, over a webinar like this. So I'm going to keep it very high level. And if you have any specific questions about any of the more complicated topics, I'd encourage you to write to me after this is over. And I'll answer all of your questions in more depth in a follow-up email that'll go out in about a week to everyone who attended. Um, so the first thing we're going to ask ourselves is, what is global selling? When we here at SellerEngine and Profit Bandit talk about global selling, we're talking about selling on more than one Amazon marketplace. That means you sell on Amazon.com and Amazon.co.uk or Amazon.co.jp and Amazon Germany, or all of the marketplaces at the same time. This is different from what a lot of people think of when they think of global selling, because many Amazon sellers think, oh, I already sell globally because I allow FBA international fulfillment. I allow people to buy my merchant fulfilled items and I'll ship them overseas. And the big reason that we don't think of that as true global selling is because people who are in the UK, or Japanese buyers who are in Japan, or German buyers in Germany, they don't go to Amazon.com. They go to their own marketplace. They go to Amazon.de. A French guy in Paris goes to Amazon.fr. They don't go to Amazon.com as their first choice. And if you're not on their natural marketplace, on their native marketplace, if you're not on Amazon.fr or Amazon.co.uk, you're missing out on sales from these buyers who just simply aren't coming to Amazon.com to buy. And it's great if you're doing international fulfillment through MFN, or you're allowing for FBA global export on the item that's eligible for, but it's not what we talk about when we talk about global selling. And before we get to the really hard stuff, I just want to say that now is the easiest time to start selling globally. It's never been easier. I don't know if anybody here ever goes to the Sellers Conference in Seattle, but the woman who puts it on, Rhonda, like 5 or 6 years ago, she had to fly over to England to get a British bank account set up so she could start selling on Amazon.co.uk. And it was a total nightmare. Now you don't even need a new bank account to start selling on Amazon.co.uk. And there's just new methods of fulfillment. We're going to talk a little bit about DHL and some of the other options you have for shipping. Shipping's never been easier. But that said, selling globally on another international Amazon marketplace isn't easy. There's lots of things you have to overcome. You have to handle what can be very challenging issues with taxes, with customs. You have to understand what VAT is, and those are three at the high level, or those are three of the more in-depth things that we're really not going to talk about too much today. I'll do my best to answer your questions, but if you have questions about VAT, taxes, and customs, the unfortunate answer to those is that it depends on where you are and where you're going, where you're going to be selling. So if you're interested in talking about that more after this, send me an email and we'll definitely explain some of those concepts in more depth. But even though global selling is easier than it's ever been before, it's still not the easiest thing in the world. It's going to take work on your part, but we think it's worth it. And here's why we think it's worth it. Check this graph. This is some older data that I had handy, but why do we want to do this? What's the value in selling internationally? And the answer is there's a heck of a lot of money being spent on Amazon overseas. Um, Between 2009 and 2012, international sales made up nearly 50% of Amazon's total revenue. And that amount has grown in the past 2 years. I believe it's going to be right around 50%, maybe a little bit higher this year. Um, and just looking at that, you can see that growing that selling internationally is a great way to almost double the amount of revenue that's available to you. If you're only selling on one Amazon marketplace, then you're missing out on a lot of customers. We've got a question here from Amy Law. Let's take a look. Yes. Sorry for being U.S. centric here, but yes, this chart here, international refers to Amazon venues that are not Amazon.com. So 45% of total Amazon sales took place on marketplaces other than Amazon.com. Thank you for clarifying that, or thank you for letting me clarify that, Amy. So just think about that. If you're looking for ways to double your potential sales, don't look any further than starting to sell globally. And today we're going to talk a little bit about some steps for getting started. There's 5 things you really need to do before you can start selling internationally. First, you have to evaluate your inventory. You have to look at the items that are available to you. You need to find out where you can sell them, or you need to find out which of them are going to be profitable on which marketplaces. You need to choose a marketplace. That means you're going to have to decide whether you want to sell in France or Germany or Spain or Italy or Canada or Japan or any of these other marketplaces, or maybe you want to sell in more than one. So first, you evaluate your inventory, you decide where you're going to sell it, and next, you pick a fulfillment method. You're going to have to decide, just as you did on Amazon.com, you're going to have to decide between MFN and FBA. Next, you're going to create an Amazon account on that marketplace, and finally, you're going to start selling. So those 5 steps are things we're going to talk about in pretty broad terms here today. We've got another question here. Yes, here's a great question. Next biggest Amazon marketplace after Amazon.com is Amazon.co.uk. And I believe after UK, it's either Germany or Japan. So the top 4 are US, UK, and then either Germany or Japan. I don't remember which one is bigger off the top of my head. But I'll include some charts, Amy, in an email that I'm going to send out to everybody who attended. So I'll include some charts that'll have some more data on this, including things like catalog size on the different marketplaces all around the world. I hope that answers your question, Amy. Evaluating your inventory. This is where you decide if global selling will work for you and your business. And you have to decide on what are your most profitable items, what's going to be profitable to sell internationally. And this is actually really easy to do. I would recommend that everybody listening to this who is selling on only Amazon.com or only on one Amazon venue, pick 5 or 10 items out of your inventory and look them up on Amazon.com. That's it. Compare the selling prices, compare what you're paying for, compare the selling prices on Amazon.co.uk to Amazon.com prices, and find out where you think you might be able to make some money. And the best way to start with this is to start by your items that you're paying the least for and have the best supply of. The reason for this is because there are other fees associated with selling internationally, global shipping, again, VATs, taxes, customs, that sort of thing that you'll have to be paying. And you have to build those into your price. So those are going to add to your cost of goods sold. So you're going to want to start with items that are inexpensive and have a good margin here in the US, and just go to amazon.co.uk and start typing in some of your products into the search box on Amazon UK. Sorry about that, I got distracted for a second. And that's the first thing to do, is just start. We've got a couple of questions here. Francesca asks, she wants to know if you need accounts for each site. And the answer is yes. You're going to need a seller account for every marketplace that you sell on. So if you're already in Amazon.com, that means you have a seller account on Amazon.com. You all know that. But if you want to start selling on an international marketplace, you're going to need to make a new account, a new seller account on Amazon.co.uk or whichever marketplace you want to sell on. There is a special type of European account called a unified European account. And that's an account that lets you sell on all the European marketplaces. Lets you sell on all the European marketplaces using only one account on one Seller Centrals. So with a unified European account, you can sell in UK, Germany, France, Italy, Spain, and the UK. Victor asks, can you do FBA in international marketplaces? Yes, you can, especially in Europe. That's a great way to get started, is by shipping items from the US to European FBA warehouses. So yes, you can do FBA in international markets, and that's something we really recommend. Maybe not for getting started because it can be a bit of a risk. Sending inventory over to the international marketplace before you've tested the waters. We'll talk about that in just a minute. Victor? Francesca asks, so I'm assuming that all the websites are in their native languages. So to list something, I would need to know Italian or French or German. That's a good question, Francesca. And yes, those sites are in the native languages. And you will need to know Italian, French, and German German for two reasons, two possible reasons. The first is if you want to add something to that website's catalog that isn't already in it, you'll need to create the product page in the native language. So if you have, say, a video game that's not available on Amazon Italy yet, and you want to add it, you're going to need to do that in Italian. And the second reason the foreign languages are so important is because, excuse me, is because you're going to need to provide customer service in that foreign language whenever you get emails from customers or questions from customers. And that's something to think about for two reasons. One, it's a really great reason to make Amazon.co.uk your first marketplace to expand to because there's going to be no issues with language. And two, it's a great reason to do FBA because when you're doing FBA, you're not going to be getting customer emails. Amazon's going to handle all of that for you. And I hope that answered your question there, Francesca. So I was just talking about this. I was just talking about choosing a marketplace. And our recommendation for people just getting started is to go to amazon.co.uk. And the reason for this is that it doesn't offer any language barriers for Amazon.com sellers here in the US. It's easy to list because .co.uk has a very big catalog. And because you're not going to need a new bank account. If you want to sell in Italy or Spain, you're going to need what's called a Eurozone bank account. So we don't recommend those two specifically for your first time. We don't recommend Japan for your brand new global sellers because of the language barrier. And because of the payment problem, the need for a bank account in Japan. If you don't have access to a Japanese bank account, selling in Japan is very difficult. We've got a question from Anthony. Anthony asks, isn't there translation software available? The answer is yes. There's plenty of good translation services out there, and you can certainly pay someone to translate for you. I'm not sure I would trust customer service to Google Translate or anything but a native speaker, but you can definitely outsource customer service with a virtual assistant, or maybe you have access to an employee who speaks a foreign language that can give you a head start on this sort of thing. And there's also something else that Anthony brings up that I didn't mention, or that Anthony reminded me of, and this is that Amazon offers a service for sellers who are coming from the U.S. to Europe, to European marketplaces. For a fee, they can translate the listings. I'll include an email address for them when I send out this email at the end of the week for you guys. Francesca's got another great question. She asks, on Amazon.co.uk, I only need my US bank account. And yes, that's correct, Francesca. However, Amazon is going to charge you a percentage of your sales to convert that money from British pounds back to US dollars. So yes, you can get away with just having the US bank account, but Amazon's going to charge you a few percentage points to convert that money from the UK, from British pounds to US dollars to get it back into your bank account. There are other services out there. We'll talk about one in a few minutes called World First that can do that cheaper. There are other services out there that can help you, but if you just have a US bank account, you can get started today with an Amazon.com or Amazon.co.uk account and just have Amazon charge you a little bit to handle the currency conversions. MFN and FBA. Let me ask here, how many people here do exclusively FBA on Amazon.com? So we've got a few people here who are exclusively FBA. And that's great. For all of you, I would say that if you're experienced with FBA, then I would recommend that you start small with FBA in UK. The reason for that is because you don't want to overextend yourself, especially when you're not 100% sure how well things are going to sell. Part of succeeding as a global seller is limiting your risk, and I would not recommend that anybody just getting started send a huge amount of inventory over to a British fulfillment center just because it can be expensive to get it back if that doesn't sell, or it can be an expensive loss of profit if you have to have that inventory disposed of if it doesn't sell over there. But one thing we tell people is that MFN, even if you are a strictly FBA seller here in the US, MFN is a great way to test the waters in the UK. This is something all of you could probably even start in the next day or so, would be to create a new Amazon.uk account, list a few of your more profitable items, and just see what sells. And the reason for this is that based on our research, we found that there are over 5 million items on Amazon.com that weigh less than 6 ounces. 6 ounces. These are really, really cheap to sell or to ship using first-class international mail or DHL Global Mail. Francesca's got another good question. She says that in the US, a lot of categories are restricted because there are way too many sellers. Example she gives is jewelry, and we all know that like grocery has been gated recently and other categories are gated. She asks, is it easier to sell on all categories on other markets? Great question, and the answer is it depends. Just like Amazon.com, Amazon.co.uk, and all the other marketplaces have different gated categories. So the answer is yes, depending on what you sell and depending on what marketplace you're selling on. One thing that you should know is anybody who's out there is doing DVDs is in really good shape if you're selling on Amazon.co.uk, because only US sellers can sell Region 1 DVDs in the UK. If you're in London and you want to sell American DVDs on Amazon, you can't. But if you're here in the US, in Chicago or New York, and you've got a really great source for unique, collectible, one-of-a-kind, rare American DVDs, you can sell those on Amazon UK, and sellers in the UK can't. So that's one example of a big advantage that Amazon sellers from the US have in the UK. And back to talking about, yes, Victor. Victor asked about needing an Amazon.co.uk seller account. And that's exactly right. Francesca asked about this a little bit before, and the answer is yes. If you're selling on Amazon.com and Amazon.co.uk, you're also going to need an Amazon.co.uk seller account. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. But right now we're talking about fulfillment methods, and I would recommend that most people get started on a small scale with a few of their inventory items on UK and fulfill them themselves. Look into using first-class mail, which is very cheap and pretty quick getting things overseas. Is anybody here familiar with DHL Global Mail? If you're not, it's a newer, certain, maybe not newer, it's a service from DHL. And so Jeff's heard of DHL Global Mail, that's great. But for everybody else, DHL Global Mail is a service where you give your items to DHL. They use their fulfillment network to get them from here to the UK or to the destination country. And then from there, they go into the local postal service and get sent through the British Royal Mail. So it combines the speed of DHL with like the cheap final mile of British Mail. So that's a really great way to get started. If you contact somebody from DHL, they can tell you a lot more about it. But basically, in conclusion, for MFN versus FBA, if you're just getting started, try some small, light items and ship them MFN just to get your feet wet. And now this is one of the easy parts of selling internationally, creating the account. All of you right now, as long as you have an international credit card, could go on amazon.co.uk and create an account today. And you could list your first item today. That's how easy it is. And the reason for this is that Amazon is Amazon. You know what Seller Central looks like. You know how it works. And it works like that on all the different international marketplaces. So that's one of the advantages of selling on Amazon versus trying to sell on other marketplaces around the world is that you already know Amazon. You know how to make a profit selling on Amazon. You know the rules. You know how to list items. You know how to fulfill them. And creating an account is probably the easiest part of selling internationally because it's just like setting up an account here in the US. Bank accounts. Francesca brought this up a little while ago. Let's mention it one more time, that with amazon.co.uk, you can use your US bank account. Amazon's going to charge you a percentage to convert your profits from British pounds back to US dollars, but it's great for just getting started. But probably the lowest cost option that we're familiar with is World First. They're a banking services provider. They provide banking services to sellers all around the world. And what they'll do is they'll provide you with a British account that can accept payments from Amazon in British pounds, and they'll convert them back to US dollars and ship them back to your account for about 3% less than Amazon will. So if you're looking to save a little bit of money after you get started, World First is a great way to do that. Excuse me. When I first started before I talk about VAT, let me check out this question from Anthony. Anthony asks, in setting up an account on amazon.co.uk, will Amazon require permission for selling in various categories? And the answer is yes. There are some gated categories in the UK. I don't have a slide with that here handy, but if you just Google amazon.co.uk gated categories, you'll see a list of them. And they're similar, but not exactly the same as gated categories in the US. So yes, there are gated categories, but a list of them is readily available on amazon.co.uk. And now finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about VAT, which is probably one of the more confusing topics. Francesca has one more question before we move on. She says, as far as Profit Bandit is concerned, when I scan something and choose UK from Profit Bandit settings, does it calculate my profits as if I were shipping my stuff from the UK or from the US? That's two questions. The first thing I have to be clear is that if you change your Amazon location to UK, it will only work if you have an amazon.co.uk pro merchant account. If you don't have an amazon.co.uk pro merchant account, you will not be able to scan items on amazon.com. Secondly, the shipping is calculated based on if you were in the UK. But you can adjust the FBA inbound shipping in Profit Bandit settings to give you a better estimate of what your costs would be for shipping an item from here to the UK. Once you figure out about what you're paying, you can adjust that setting, or you can just kind of mentally add or subtract a couple extra dollars to cover fulfillment. But remember, if you want to use Profit Bandit on Amazon UK, you need an Amazon UK Pro Merchant account. And so VAT. VAT is kind of like a sales tax. That's probably the shortest way to put it. It's a value-added tax that is built into the price of the items you sell in Europe and the UK. And it's about 20%. And basically 20% of the sales price is going to be VAT. And VAT is something that you must register for if your sales are more than 81,000 British pounds per year. You can register and learn more about VAT at hmrc.gov.co.uk. Before I talk a little bit more about this, we've got one more question. Victor asks, will the merchant account mean an additional $29.99 a month? The answer to this is yes, but that's not exactly the right amount. You're always welcome to use the free selling account on amazon.co.uk to get started, but a pro merchant account for the UK costs about 30 British pounds per month. I think it's around 30 British pounds, which is something like 40 or 45 US dollars. But yes, if you want a pro merchant account for the UK, you will have to pay a separate pro merchant subscription, $49.75. Thanks, Victor. I wasn't too up to date on the current exchange rates. Okay, VAT. VAT is important because it's going to be something that eats into your profits, because it's going to be built into your selling price. If you see an item selling for, say, $50 on amazon.co.uk, some of that money, some of that $50 is going to be VAT, a value-added tax that gets paid to the British government. There are ways to get part of your VAT back depending on what you paid for the item and how you got the item in the first place. It can be a little confusing, and I'm going to send out a VAT FAQ to everybody who attended and who registered for this webinar, just to make it a little more sensible. But understand that VAT is something that you're going to have to pay unless you're a bookseller. There is no VAT on books in the UK. That's just a little, for all you booksellers, that makes it a heck of a lot easier. Also registering for VAT, there is a threshold of about 80,000 British pounds per year, last I checked, unless that has changed recently. And the good news is, unlike in the past, you can do all this paperwork online. You don't actually need to go to the UK to become an amazon.co.uk seller. You can do all of this stuff online, and you can figure it all out from your computer without ever setting foot in the UK. And that's just a high-level look at selling on amazon.co.uk. If anybody has any more questions about selling internationally, I'll take them now, and if I can answer them, I will. If not, I'll get answers to everybody when I send out a link to this webinar, along with some links and some more resources in about a week. Any questions? Not getting many questions here today because everybody's ready for the Labor Day weekend. So I'll say thank you all for attending. It was really great talking to you and great answering your questions about selling on Amazon and selling globally. And be on the lookout for an email with these slides, some more resources about selling internationally, and we got one more question here. Okay, what's your question, Francesca? And if anybody has a question about this webinar or anything else, be sure to send me an email to support, SUPPORT, at profitbanditapp.com, the same email address that you send all your Profit Bandit support questions to. Oh, Francesca answered her own question somehow, so we'll say that's great. Thanks again, everybody, for attending. I hope everybody has a wonderful Labor Day weekend. Hope you enjoy using Profit Bandit. Hope you find some great stuff. And be on the lookout for next Friday, an email from me with more information on selling globally, more information on VAT. And if you have any questions in the meantime, please send me an email. It's great talking to you guys every month. And I hope you've been enjoying your Profit Bandit subscriptions. And I'm really glad that you took some time out of your Friday to listen to me talk to you. I really love talking to all of you guys. Have a wonderful weekend. And I'll talk to you next month. Bye-bye.